Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Rational Standard. I'm Martin van Staden, joined today by Ayanda Zulu and Zakhele Mthembu. And this week, we're going to discuss limited government, decentralized government. The Free Market Foundation published its Next Liberty First report earlier this week with Dr. Morne Malan, specifically focusing on cabinet reduction. So we have an infamously large cabinet in South Africa. And next month, I think it's the 12th, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana is going to deliver his medium term budget policy statement. February, again, we'll have another budget. We go through that process again that we went through earlier this year. Um, and the fundamental questions never get asked. Whenever there's cutting in South Africa, whenever we're talking about cutting, it's like 1.5 million rand here and kind of 2 million rand there on nonsense. But that really doesn't change anything in the greater scheme of things. And what the FMF is proposing is to actually make a difference there, to actually do some real cuts. That dreaded word, austerity. So that's what this aspect of our Liberty First project was all about, and we thought we'd get into a bit of a discussion on that today. Zakes was the host of the press briefing where Mornay introduced his paper and then kind of went through the highlights. So I was thinking, Zakes, maybe just give us kind of a high-level overview of the ideas in the report, and then we will get into it.
Cool. Well, yeah, the paper was pretty cool, right? The paper was pretty cool. As you said, it's about small government reducing the size of the cabinet, right? So pretty much Monet makes a very interesting point. Contrast South Africa with like the whole other countries by using things like the percentage of our GDP that is spent on the public service, right? I think we spend nearly a third of our GDP or the total value thereof on the public service. And he mentions and contrasts this with other countries. It is pretty much we are an outlier in this respect. And if anyone was watching the press briefing, I kept on talking about how South Africa is leading and is number one, really, even in the worst instances. But we are pretty much an outlier. And then when compared to similar, economies of a similar size, or even worse with like developed economies, some developed economies don't even have, a third, or like that is not recommended. And then this in part contributes to our low growth levels because it crowds out private investment. So I thought the crowding out of private investment idea was pretty cool because it seems a bit Austrian. So yeah, it crowds out private investment. It discourages people from actually, investing in the states. And not only that, our expenditure is not infrastructure based. That is why we still have these problems we have with our railways and our general logistics, right? Infrastructure that is owned by the states. We aren't spending all of this money in the things that in fixed capital that will help at the very least, the private sector in, operating much more efficiently. Instead, a large portion of our public spending is spent on salaries, right? And the salaries are pretty high. We don't even have a high actual, physical count of people who are employed. So we don't have a large proportion of the population, even though it is pretty large, right? Like I think we have over 17 point something percent, according to the paper, of our population employed in the public service, which is also we are number one in that. We are an outlier since most countries usually have something about like 8 to 10%, right? We are just shooting above all that. So that is pretty much the I guess the data context, the statistical context of our huge government. But of course, the paper presents that like an solution, an alternative to that would be reducing the size of our cabinet, specifically the executive, from like 32 ministries currently, with like 37 deputy ministers, to about 10. And the 10 cabinet ministry ideas is something that we came up with at the FMF, of course, starting from like when we launched Liberty First and when the GNU was something that was being, considered. We were afraid that the cabinet was going to explode, and we were right, at least. So, that is where the idea stems from. And most of the cabinet positions there are like constitutionally mandated, meaning, you can't really get rid of them without amending the constitution. So, let's just limit ourselves to those. And yeah, those cabinet positions will greatly reduce the cost that we have. Like Monet has an entire 3-year roadmap in how we can actually get to the point of cutting, the government departments, and it is pretty much about easing the South African populace in, for lack of a better term. We ease them into austerity, but we definitely do need austerity, right? By reducing the cabinet size, it will in turn reduce the amount that we spend in our public service. And if we do that, it means that we get, our debt to GDP ratio stabilized, has, a easing effect. If there aren't any taxes that will any tax increases that will accompany those, it will have an easing effect, grow our tax base. Generally, all the good things that come with austerity, right? That has been proven, even though a lot of people don't like it. But Monet isn't as radical as me. I am a Thatcherite. Yeah, I am like, let us gut everything. But he's like, nah, a 3-year roadmap. You kinda, make them get used to the idea of having a smaller government. But the 3-year plan in and of itself is like pretty great. So yeah, I would suggest anyone who hasn't read the paper to go do that. The gist of it really is that our state is too big, and we are an outlier in that respect. There are international comparisons of what happens when a state gets smaller, right? Outside of, like, indexes like Freedom of the World, like the Heritage Foundation, Manuel mentioned, Fraser Institute, all of these indexes that measure, you know, freedom in the world show a great correlation between a small government and, a prosperous economy. And as such, we can do that. Namibia, our neighbor, right, is already doing that. It reduced the size of its cabinet, and I think that is something to try and emulate. But yeah, the paper makes that case. Reduce the size of the cabinet, it will grow your economy. Here are historical and, international examples of, governments that have done this, and have it has resulted in increased economic growth in South Africa, where I think we all would agree that we greatly need that. So yeah, that is it.
Cool.
Kind
Yeah.
of a
So
very
I've
brief
mm, yeah,
description.
yeah,
I'm
no,
sorry.
I so we encourage everyone to go and look at the paper itself. It's called Lean but Efficient: The Fiscal and Moral Imperative of Cutting South Africa's Cabinets, on the Free Market Foundation website. Yeah, the detail is in there, but I think kind of something to highlight. This is where everyone gets their kind of panties in a twist about austerity, is, oh, you're going to cut social services, but in fact this plan doesn't cut any of that really. um,
Yeah.
it it uh, it cuts out the top heaviness of cabinet, and that does involve eliminating whole departments. So it's not merely symbolic. I think symbolic gets a bad rap. It's often called theatrics. I think you shouldn't knock theatrics until you've tried it. I think showing taxpayers that you respect them is important. I think that symbolic gesture is important in a constitutional democracy, but it's not merely symbolic. Um, Departments like sports, arts, and culture. The recommendation is to get rid of those. Science and technology has to go. Tourism has to go. But your grants and these things, it's not gonna be touched. It's still gonna be paid. I think there is a discussion to be had about cutting social welfare spending, but that's not what this is about, and it's not necessary to cut that if you want to cut the size and scope of government. We just have so much vanity projects in the South African government that they don't lead to any tangible socioeconomic or developmental goals, and we need to be honest about that. That money would be far better spent by taxpayers starting businesses, investing in existing businesses, creating jobs. Um, and I guess the other thing is that's important to note when a department is cut, because a lot of these kind of opportunistic journalists in our media, they're like, but it's, if you cut a minister and his staff, then it's only what 100 and or what 20 billion, a million rand for that minister. What are you really achieving? It's a drop in the bucket. No, every minister that exists has some legislation that grants them power to issue regulations. So it's not just the minister and just their staff. If you get rid of that portfolio, that's why I prefer speaking in terms of portfolios rather than ministers or departments. If you get rid of the portfolio, that whole kind of realm of regulation also goes away. And that means the free market, the kind of dynamic, efficient market forces, kind of step into the breach, and that means more economic room for breathing for the normal, real, productive economy. So it's not merely a symbolic gesture. It's about getting rid of ministers. It's about signaling to the taxpayer that the government does respect them. It doesn't, but at least pretend that you do. So it's about those things, but also getting rid of that portfolio entirely, so that the question of, wow, geez, there's a lacuna here, like they told us in law school. There's a gap in the law. We must fill the gap. It's like, no. That gap in the law might be there for a reason. There might be a reason why the common law doesn't tell you how big your toilet seat has to be. So actually leave it alone. And that's really what this report gets to. So yeah, we would encourage everyone to read it. But Ayanda, you have some strong thoughts about this as well.
Yes, thanks very much, Martin. I think you and Zakes have done a very good job of identifying what the problem is and how it can be resolved. I think what I want to contribute today is what has led us to the problem, or what has created the problem that we have in front of us today, which is not just a bloated cabinet, but in the broader scheme of things, a bloated state as well. So I think there are perhaps 2 points that I want to make for now, and then later on we can move into the state itself and decentralization. The first point is that our cabinet was already bloated before we had this GNU, this arrangement we have now in place. It was already a big cabinet. There was no need for it to be that big. And one of the reasons why it was bloated is because of the ANC and patronage, and how the ANC has no problem with expanding the size of cabinet so it can accommodate its own comrades and create jobs for them. And a good example of this is uh, Dr. Ramahupa, who is now the Minister of Electricity and Energy. Bear in mind that this there was a restructuring that took place. Remember that we had a Department of Mineral Resources and Energy at some point. They created this position, and the president said it was a temporary position. At some point, he was supposed to vacate it once we had addressed the energy crisis. That did not happen. What happened is it was restructured, and now you have two distinct ministries. You have a ministry of minerals and petroleum resources. You also have one of electricity and energy. So what you have now is another cadre in cabinet who has a job. And I argued the other day that we don't need him to be there. As the president said, his position was temporary. He was supposed to vacate it after we had addressed the problem. I would like to think the problem isn't as bad as it was then. Of course, we still do need reform in the energy sector, but we aren't in that crisis anymore, and that the guy still has a job. So patronage is a very big problem when it comes to the ANC. To my second point, of course, the formation of the GNU has also expanded the cabinet because we now have this multi-party coalition where we have to accommodate all these many smaller parties, including the DA itself, which is a hypocritical party. It has been campaigning for years, arguing that the size of cabinet also needs to be reduced. Cabinet is bloated. And when the opportunity presented itself, instead of opting for a confidence and supply arrangement, they chose to enter government. And now some of them are ministers, they have jobs, they move around in all these convoys, and they now also get these salaries and they also get these perks uh, as well. So my point is that if the DA had not entered government, if they had not been drawn by, this lure of being in government, of being chauffeured around, we would not have a cabinet that is further expanded. So really my 2 points are: number one, the ANC has a very, very big problem with patronage. It views the state as an instrument to empower itself and its own network, and this applies in many, many, many areas. And the second point is that the GNU has ballooned our cabinet. If we did not have this kind of arrangement and the DA had opted for a confidence and supply arrangement, which would have still helped it to avoid the so-called doomsday coalition. Because at the end of the day, if you could provide the ANC with confidence and you could ensure that its budgets could be approved, you could keep the EFF out of government. This is something Martin noted back in 2022, November, that you don't need to go into government if you want to keep the EFF out. You can provide the ANC with confidence, ensure that we have a stable government, that a president is elected, the government can operate and implement its budget. But the DA, for whatever reason, which remains unclear to me to this day, chose to enter government. And they are now in all these departments where they're getting paid as ministers. So really, the problems we're dealing with here are patronage and political arrangements that are unnecessary.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just kind of on that point. So yeah, we at the FMF, I think we don't all have the same view on this necessarily, but I think in general we're a bit more sympathetic to the idea of a no elision, like you just described, a confidence and supply arrangement. We pushed for that during the formation of the GNU, but when the GNU was formed, or when we got the indication that there would be a GNU, we said, okay, fine. So now that decision has been made, fine. But there are now certain things that, given this decision, that need to happen. We said that there had to be preconditions, and those were all substantive. But another thing, and you reminded me of this thought now, Ayanda, is that, and this is the fallacy that keeps coming up in the discourse. They're like, and Ramapara is the big kind of culprit here. He said, everyone criticized me for expanding the state, but nah, you wanted a multi-party government. You wanted to vote the ANC out, so now we're gonna have a bloated cabinet. It's like, my guy, did you know that you can also divide 10 by several? Like, you don't have to have 80 ministers and only then can you divide them by several. No, you can in fact do that with 10 as well. Just because you have this notion of oh, we have to have a minister of agriculture or we have to have a minister of sport, that this seems inevitable. But in reality, what I think the DA, the IFP, the Freedom Front should have said is, okay, cool, we're here now. Not all of us need to be in cabinet. Give us a director generalship here, give us a minister without portfolio, then you are in cabinet, but you don't have that regulatory power. Give us a ministership without portfolio, maybe there, then we have influence in cabinet, but we don't have a department. But keep the cabinet small and divide it in that way between us. The ANC has 5 or 6 positions, the DA has 2, Freedom Front has 1, etc., or maybe 11, and you divide it up. But you don't start at 80 or at 70 or something and then say, okay, cool, everyone is just going to be a minister now. 1/5 of members of parliament are in cabinet. Think about that. And this is I don't usually get into kind of flaws in the constitution. I think there are a lot of flaws in the constitution, but I think it's kind of counterproductive to get stuck on them. But one of the flaws in the constitution is that the president could appoint every sitting member of parliament, every single one, into cabinet as a minister or a deputy minister. Think about that. It's ridiculous. They can, like, there's this idea that, oh, there's no strict separation between the executive and the legislature in South Africa. And it's like, okay, cool, there's going to be some overlap. But literally every member of parliament can be in the executive. That is insane. That is completely bonkers to me. There's no limiting principle. And I think 1/5 already is a problem. It presents a significant problem for parliamentary government in this country. So yeah, just I thought I'd just add some of those considerations that you don't, even if you have coalition politics, you don't have to have this huge cabinet. You can have a tiny cabinet and still have your coalition and still have the kind of wheeling and dealing and your patronage networks if you really need to. You can do all of that without having a top-heavy government like this. Zakes.
Hmm. Yeah, man. Like, the no elision position. It's very interesting. I probably will be a DA defender, DA representative by the time we get to episode 100 of the Rational Standard podcast, right? Because like the positions to me like a bit of nuance, right? Like, and I get it. I am, as I said, I am way too great. The DA had a full mandate. I'll be like, let us get on their asses for not reducing the size of the state, for not leaning more into their liberal roots, even though they are, social democrats party too. But I'm like, hey, let us hammer them in. But I think we have to consider, like, the general ideological underpinnings of all of these parties. The ANC does not see a reduced cabinet as something to aspire for, right? So when we talk about eliminating the Ministry of Sports, Arts and Culture, they'll be like, man, these guys are like deluded. What will we do if Gaten doesn't have that, can't go watch, can't go to Paris Fashion Week or go to the US as he will be next year, or go to, Rugby World Cup finals and other. What would happen to the South African sports fan? It would not exist. So to them, it does not compute that, like, all of these ministries are not necessary. Ministry of Tourism, and like, what are these tourism businesses gonna do? Run themselves? That is pretty absurd. So, trying to get these parties that see how a state should be constituted, just to begin with, to agree for a reduced cabinet like the one that we're proposing, which is the best idea. Like, I can't, me talking about the context does not mean that, a smaller cabinet is not the best option. It is. It is what we should be going for. It is what we need to, primarily for me, reduce the amount of money we spend on our top heavy executive, as you say, Martin. But like, the politics of it all did not bear that out, as we are currently living through that. So I find that saying that the DA was hypocritical, right, is to Makeba's point, is like a stretch, a stretch, in the sense that the DA, if they go into a confidence and supply politically, they get to endorse the ANC without actually being in any position of government, right? They will still get the flag of supporting the ANC without having the inkling of an opportunity to say, hey, at least we did something a little bit there in Department of Basic Education and got rid of pit toilets, or like what we think that the Ministry of Home Affairs is like, it is deporting people at a very, very high clip. Actually, at least according to the reports that I'm seeing, which is not good, which is not great. But hey, politically maybe it'll work for them if we look at the state of the world right now. So I'm like, there's no opportunity for all of those things. There's no opportunity for them to leverage something in the upcoming general elections to be like, okay, cool, the ANC had lost power, and this is what we managed to do, irrespective of whether you think that they managed to do anything or not, right? So I'm like, I see why politically they would have taken that decision, like, and then a pure Machiavellian sense, like, okay, cool, we'll get to, be in the government and then also supports the ANC, but the ministries they got, if one looks at them outside, maybe you could say, of basic education, like the aren't ministries that have the most power to effect real economic change in South African lives, right? I think there's deputy minister in Treasury. I hope that they have one, but I know I would have wanted Treasury to be the ministry that they got, because that is where we get to effect, all of these spending changes that the South African state needs. So yeah, I get them politically. I get why they would take the decisions that they did, even though I may not agree with all of them entirely, but I genuinely do get that. And from a self-interested South African perspective, I'm like, South Africa is better now that there are no, at least, pit toilets, as far as I'm aware, in our schools, right? Well, at least according to the Department of Basic Education. I think that is objectively good, and it just so happened that that happened when there was a minister from a different party governing that particular department. We can have an exercise in thinking, hey, maybe it would have happened even if that minister was not there. It was on the way of getting phased out, but that is what has happened. And I think that is something that is good, so I get why a party would take that type of a decision. It is, of course, unfortunate that it led to the exploding of cabinets as it did, because eh, politicians suck. To Makeba's point, and to you, Martin, like, patronage is really the whole point, right? Like the entrenching of patronage networks. So it sucks that that was not eliminated entirely from our political space. The constitutional aspects of it all, right? Separation of powers. I'm becoming way too much of a realist when it comes to it. I don't know. Donald Trump has messed me up because he's legislating from the White House. He's passing laws, and Americans are like amazing. Even people from the Federalist Society, like smart guys that I used to trust, who I thought understood the danger, in doing that are like, no, no, it's okay, pass legislation. And then the Supreme Court is like, hey, profiling is great. It's a very weird time to live, right, in the world. So especially separation of powers, to me, I think I'm becoming much of a realist, at least in my understanding of it, and I don't like legal realism. So that sucks, but reality will do that to you. So yeah, I think it is a problem, but I think the general resource constraints, right? So there aren't unlimited resources, so we can't technically appoint everyone to cabinet. Maybe that will help, but it is not good that we have not seen a reduction in cabinet. I think in our history we hardly do. Instead, we keep on seeing more and more and more. And now we have the new ministry of like energy and electricity, which has, as I said, to our competencies with the Ministry of Mineral Resources and Mineral and Petroleum Resources. I'm like, but petroleum is energy. But hey, who cares? There's a Kada who has a job now. But yeah, that is unfortunate. We of course wanted to change, but I think that we should consider the general ideological underpinnings of these parties that constitutes our state for right now, right? Like in as much as I want to have a purely and strictly liberal party that will like implement these ideas, not because they're liberal ideas, but because they're ideas that work, the ideas that have been proven to work, and they're ideas that will improve the lives of South Africans. It is unfortunate that we don't have that for now, but I think that I get where the DA was machinating from, for lack of a better term. So yeah, I do get that. I don't think that should have been politically viable for them to be like confidence in supply and then still get blamed for the ANC's governance pretty much, because they're like, you supported this. You supported this. I think that was still gonna be a possibility, but yeah, that is it at least for now. We can get into the nice stuff on decentralization and stuff.
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, just kind of, I think I basically agree with you on all of that. I just think that the way that politics gets manifested doesn't necessarily have to be this way. So one of the things I've always criticized the DA, but not just the DA, many others for, is the ease with which the ANC's premises are just always accepted. The thing that makes me kind of the thing that I still don't kind of I can't get over it. I'll never get over it. Is how Panyaza Lesufi in Gauteng was nominated for premier by the DA, voted in by the DA, without, to my knowledge, and I've asked, I've tried to get an answer, but without, to my knowledge, them ever having sat down, kind of and discussed. Okay, cool. We're gonna do this thing now. So yes, Premier Lesufi, you're gonna give us this. We're gonna vote you in. This is how it's gonna go. Here's the timeline. None, nothing, none of that. Just nominate former Premier Lesufi as premier, and there he goes. And then kind of he treats him with contempt from the start. Whereas we wouldn't have said necessarily, oh, you just have to refuse outright to do anything, but say that, hey, kind of go and sit down with the man and kind of come to an agreement. And if you cannot come to an agreement, then you obviously have to be like, okay, so we're not going to vote for you then, because we couldn't come to an agreement. Because that's what reasonable people do: is you sit down, you try to reach some kind of understanding. And kind of on the numbers, I've repeated this a few times, but I think it's important to remind voters of this. The multi-party charter that was established in 2023, I think, early 2023, with William Gumede as kind of the facilitator, and Action SA, Freedom Front, or a bunch of small parties. Those parties together in Gauteng got more votes than the ANC. The MPC parties got more votes than the ANC. They weren't a majority party, just together they were bigger than the ANC. What does that mean? In a politically healthy society, that means that in Gauteng, the MPC parties go to Panyaza Lesufi and say, cool, you are now the deputy premier, Panyaza Lesufi. We, as the MPC parties, are choosing, I don't know, Soli Matlatsi or something. He's going to be the premier of Gauteng. No, none of that happened. It wasn't even, I mean, this frustrates me to no end. It wasn't even discussed. It wasn't even mooted as an idea. No, Panyaza Lesufi. He is our guy. He is the guy. He's the man. kind of just went full whole hog on that. The IFP, they're comfortable in government in Gauteng. I think they are the MMC for or the MEC for e-government or something. And a bunch of other MPC parties are there and they're happy. They're kind of good. This is cool. The DA, to its credit, said, okay, we're gonna step back from this, but too little, too late. You put him in power without so yeah. That's just a single manifestation of a far bigger problem where the DA, the first question they ask is, what does the ANC want? What does the ANC want in its heart of hearts? What do they want? And whatever that is, we want to give it to them. That to me is a problem. That is a big, big problem. You can be reasonable, you can be a team player, you can be practical, you can be pragmatic. Without that, you don't have to do that. Like you can compromise, you can fight it out and debate it out, and then come to some kind of agreement that is equitable to all parties. So I actually couldn't find anything in what you said that I necessarily agree with, Zakes. I just think that we put too little emphasis on political cultural mentalities that our people operate with. I think we assume too easily often that they see things our way, but they have certain political constraints that they have to face, and therefore they have to compromise, which I think is not necessarily correct. I don't think they see things our way. I think that people in the DA thinks that it's kind of completely appropriate to have a Department of Tourism. I think you'll find senior people in the DA who will say, "Of course, we need a Department of Tourism. We're such a beautiful country. Look at all the mountains and the beaches. We need the government to kind of do something in that respect." I think there are senior people in the DA who would say that, which is kind of bonkers to me. It's insane. So if I thought that yes, the DA are on side, they understand what the government should look like, but my God, they're really coming up against a very inequitable kind of political landscape, I would say, okay, fine, sure, I get it, but that's not quite my feeling. But yeah, I mean, Ayanda, if you want to jump in here, I think you've been itching for a chance.
Yes, right of reply. Right of reply. No, Zakes is describing what some people would call realpolitik. I think that is the term. And is really trying to explain their their perspective or how they reasoned about it. I don't necessarily agree with him, but I do understand what he's trying to do. For me, it is a very simple thing, and maybe you can criticize me for this. I simply want to hold you to your promises. I want you to be consistent in what you fight for in the country. And if for years you have been complaining about the size of cabinet, arguing that it needs to be reduced, criticizing the ANC for patronage and how it expands the size of cabinet and the state at large to accommodate its friends, and people in its network, then I think you need to honor that. When the time comes for you, you need to honor that. I can understand Zakes' argument, but really, my point is the DA needs to walk the talk. You can't talk and then not walk the talk. But the last point I want to add, which Zakes sort of alluded to when he mentioned the ideology of certain parties, and this brings me to my point about what I think is the bigger problem here, because it isn't just confined to cabinet. We also have a bloated state as well in South Africa. And that bloated state exists in part because of ideology, because there are organizations that conceive of the state as an instrument of empowerment. They believe that the state should absorb people, it should create employment, it should play a leading role in the economy. They don't believe that it is the market that should be the engine of empowerment, growth, and job creation, and so forth. And so my worry is that there are actually many parties in South Africa across the political spectrum. It isn't just the ANC, even the social democratic parties, whether it be Rise Mzansi, whether it be Bosa, etc. These are all sort of parties whose ideological outlook doesn't stray away too much from the ANC's. In fact, I would argue that there's little difference between the ideology of Rise Mzansi and the ANC. Not long ago, I saw the leader of Rise Mzansi, Songezo Zibi at some point. I think him and Musi were at some ANC conference where they were engaging ANC leaders. So really, these again are parties fundamentally that don't accept this premise that it must be the market that really drives growth, that drives creation, that drives empowerment. These are people who believe that the market should be restricted, there should be certain regulations that are imposed, and all these kinds of things. So the point I'm getting at is that this is not just about patronage. This is also fundamentally about ideology. And if parties do not understand that it isn't the role of the state to create jobs or to absorb people, but rather to create an environment where businesses should create jobs for people and drive growth, we will find ourselves really in this mess and we will not be able to resolve it.
Mm. Yeah, Jakes, if you want to just come in on that, then we're going to go over
Mhm.
into maybe a little bit more on decentralization and federalism.
Ah, cool. Yeah, like there's a word called Lisufism, right? The appearance of being busy whilst doing nothing. That is Lesufism, and I don't get the why so many people are enamored by the man. When I look at his track record, I'm like, my province has gotten worse ever since you were in charge. Everything has gotten worse ever since you started becoming in charge. But yeah, you are right, much. I think to your point really earlier on, right? That like it that like understanding political dynamics does not mean conceding, and it's unfortunate. Like it really should not happen. If the multi-party charter parties could have constituted a premiership without the ANC, then they should have, right? The fact that they didn't is just a political opportunity that was lost. But then you look at the dynamics within those very same parties, right? Like I'm sure the multi-charter party had the DN and actually say, and as we saw during the budget, whatever political motivations motivated those parties, they took that metric of positions. And you would think that, they would at least take positions that are quite similar, but we sit here with higher vet. So thank you to everyone who voted for that. I mean, that includes everyone, every party. So yeah. Thank you for that, everyone. But either way, I get why that is problematic. We should definitely hammer everyone who does not at least try to pursue what we perceive as their self-interest to the fullest extent. But the thing is that we are like, we are talking about political parties, and to Makeba's point, uh, like you'll hardly find in South Africa, or I would say the world outside of maybe the Libertarian Party in the United States, and even they have weirdos like socialist libertarians, like those weird weirdos. So like even they have those people like that, and I'm like it becomes very difficult, right? Maybe it's because I have been like a long time ago part of a political organization, so I understand the different varying forces that come to bear on an organization as big as that. And I'm like, you will scan like from the DA, like the DA's official policy document that they adopted at their policy conference, right? And I like the DA for that because they have policy conferences. So you can actually see the things that their delegates vote for, the ideas that they want to see, reflected or advocated for by their party. And they also don't, take a libertarian stance fully, right? They at least acknowledge the premise of free markets. They are one of the few parties who actually mentioned that the market has to be the one that generates and drives growth, but they don't operate from the premise that the state is a evil that must be contained. No. They are statists too. They are like, no, there's a role for it. They advocate for what is the social development goals, right? UN SDGs and UN SDGs and necessarily able to be implemented by a small and lean state. So they also have that form, and then you have extreme, of course, ends of the spectrum on the other side with like parties like the AFF who are like, nah, like entire industries. We want them to be nationalized. We want to nationalize like what the commanding heights of the economy, as they would say. So you have that extreme end, but even they, I'm sure, because I always make fun of them about how they are socialists, but they will support things like, small businesses. I'm like, nah, like you can't do that. Small businesses is a capitalist thing. That's my thing. Don't take my thing from me, dog. But yeah, they will also do that in their confused molecule self. So it's like, yeah, these parties, I would say across the world, right, aren't ideologically where we want them to be. But I guess that's part of our job to try and convince them and push them further to the right side of these ideas. But yeah, I think if we are gonna hold that as their standard, they will just tell you, to Martin's point, you'll find senior DA, politicians will be like, the tourism industry is needed. How? What do you mean we don't need the tourism industry? These businesses can't run themselves, dummy. So yeah, we need a tourism industry, so a tourism ministry, that is. So I'm like, yeah, it is something that we should always take account of, right? That like we are operating in a very like a political context, that these ideas, it finds them as something of an other, right? But because their ideas that are correct, we still have elements of them present in our current reality because no party is willing to fully disavow the truth, right? And that is why liberty is great, because it's the truth. And I think our parties, even they realize that, hey, you need those markets. You need some semblance of markets activity. You need some semblance of market dynamism, even though they disagree on the outer edges. This is what I tell myself, by the way, when I'm trying to not get bogged down by melancholy after I see things like the NHI or any headliner like that. I'm like, no, no, there's good. There's good out there in the world. Not all of them are communists. But yeah, I think there's something that we should definitely keep in mind regarding, and like I think Martin's point to me is the important one, right? Like these people don't, we think that they assume the same things that we do, but they don't. That is why they can take these decisions, and it is unfortunate. I just see it as challenge. We have to try and do more to try and reach them, because they are easier to reach, right? Like we can't reach someone who wears a red beret because they think that we are enemy number one. But these ones who are blue, at least, you're like, hey, I can reach you. Even the ones like the Rise and Bossa ones, right? Weird as they are too, like the you can reach them. Anyone who calls themselves a centrist, right, is someone who at least acknowledges that there's good on the other side. So you just need to make them cleanse the evil from the left, and then you can bring them over to the light. So yeah.
Mm, mm. No, absolutely. Thanks, X. That's well said. Just as we segue into the next topic, I just want to conclude on this is our practical proposal from the Free Market Foundation for a cabinet. This is completely constitutional. There is nothing unconstitutional about this. That argument that's often brought up that you can't do this because it's against the law. No, all the constitutional kind of mandated portfolios are there, like cooperative governance. You don't really need a minister of cooperative governance in any real sense of the word, but unfortunately that is something that is mandated, so that is in there. But with these 10 portfolios, you still have social grants, you still have unfortunately the welfare state intact, but alongside a much needed deference to the taxpayer and to industry, to say that actually you can get going, you can do stuff without having to be kind of have these multiple masters. So the we spoke about energy earlier, and mineral resources and so forth. And Mornay recommends taking this blueprint that the FMF set, that there should be a department of infrastructure and natural resources, which would be public works, transport, electricity, energy, forestry and fisheries, agriculture, all of those things in this one department of infrastructure and natural resources. And that means that if you are doing business in any of those areas, you just have to know what regulations are coming from this one minister. So it's kind of a red tape reduction exercise, which is it's important. It's important to get the economy going, especially if you want the welfare state. You need the economy working completely in overdrive if you want a welfare state. So that's kind of our proposal. You can have the best of both worlds, is what people call it. I wouldn't characterize it that way, but you can have the working economy and the nanny state if you just exercise some measure of fiscal prudence with a healthy dose of respect for the taxpayer. So that segues us, I think, for these last few minutes into another topic that's close to all of our hearts. I just want to share my screen again. And that is obviously decentralization and federalism. Just see. There we go. This is an article by Ayanda, which appeared in the Rational Standard on our text side, rationalstandard.com. Please visit and please look at our content there. The limits of constitutionalism in a unitary state. Now, this is kind of the type of thing that really gets me going. And I'm not going to read the whole article. I encourage everyone to do so. But effectively, it comes down to how the ANC and a lot of the liberation movements portrayed federalism as this backwards racist kind of thing, and that kind of diffused the very strong movement for federalism and decentralization in South Africa that comes over decades. And I really found that interesting. And I think discourse of this nature is very important amongst us, yes, because federalism has also evaporated from liberal discourse since the 90s, which is a problem. So we need to get back into it, but also conservatives need to get into it. And I mean, there's also a healthy, though muted, tradition of federalism amongst aspects of the left. At different times, like in the US now, Donald Trump is in charge again, so we have sanctuary cities again. So it's not a right versus left thing. There's a lot of overlap here that needs to be spoken about. So Ayanda, I was thinking maybe you want to give us a Spark Notes version of your article, and then we'll chat about it.
Right. Thank you very much, Martin, for that. I think the first point I want to make is that the racism claim, when it comes to any discussion, is really unhelpful. I think it prevents us from having the kinds of discussions that we need to have. We are a diverse country, and naturally we are going to disagree on many things. But it's still important for us to have open discourse, civil discourse, where we try to understand these differences and we try to make sense of them. So these claims of racism, and attaching racism to federalism is really unhelpful. But to my article and the essence of what I was really arguing here, and I want to explain this in very simple terms. What I was saying is that the Constitution and the Constitution alone, I would argue, has not been enough to safeguard freedom in a context where power remains centralized. In a context where power is held by a few. It is vested in the political center of a country, so to speak. And the reason for that, or one of the reasons for that, is because we live in a unitary state. That means you have the single central government that still passes laws that apply to the entire country, not just one region or one province, etc. And in a unitary state, the lower divisions, like the provinces, really become bodies that rubber stamp the policies of the central government. They don't really have any degree of autonomy. If it is there, it's limited, but they generally don't have, this degree of autonomy that allows them to write their own laws and set their own policies. So that creates a problem because you have the small elite in Pretoria, which has, of course, been elected by a majority. It represents the values and the views of that majority, but it doesn't represent the views and the values of everyone else in the country. But you have them essentially being able to set laws that have to apply to Bella. It has to apply to all of us in South Africa. If they pass NHI, it must apply to all of us. If they pass the Expropriation Act, it must apply to all of us. So essentially, you have a political system that binds us to the will of the majority in the country, and we really have no way out of it. And the argument or the proposition I made is that what we need to complement constitutionalism with, because constitution is only as strong as the institutions that uphold it. Constitutionalism depends on the judiciary to enforce it. So if your judiciary is timid, for lack of a better word, or it is politicized, that is also going to be a problem. But ultimately, the solution to this is to decentralize power, is to disperse it across the country and ensure that it isn't centralized in the single central government. Because what that does is that it gives other regions greater autonomy to design their own laws, to shape their own laws, and to govern themselves according to their own values without having to rubber stamp policies that are determined by this elite that holds power in Pretoria. So the core of my argument is that federalism is important for complementing constitutionalism. It's going to give these many different regions in South Africa greater autonomy to be able to shape their own destinies, to be able to shape their own laws, and be able to govern themselves really according to their own values without being held or tied to the will of the majority in the country.
Yeah, no, again, I encourage everyone to read the article, and I think the one thing that stands out to me, and like I'm Jake was speaking about legal realism earlier. I'm something of a formalist, but not necessarily. I do think that there is a lot of importance to be assigned to what the text of the Constitution says, but then at the same time, you have to be realistic about what is being done, in fact, about what the text says. And one of the arguments that I've been making for a while and that the FMF has been making for a while, and in fact, I don't want to call it an argument or a claim, it's a fact, is that South Africa is a federation. It is constitutionally a federal system, in the same way that Austria is. The difference is, and this is kind of, this manifests how ridiculous the situation is that Austria calls itself a federation. Its constitution says we're a federal republic. And if you ask political scientists, if you ask kind of the president of South Africa, what is Austria? He'll say it's a federation. South Africa's constitution is virtually kind of exactly the same. Like it's the same thing. The only difference is it doesn't say we're a federal republic. And if you ask political scientists, they will say, no, we're a unitary state. But to some degree, we're in fact more decentralized than Austria, especially to the municipalities. Our constitution grants a massive degree of autonomy to municipalities, more so than it does to the provinces, which makes our system quite odd, I would say. But in that sense, we are a federal system formally, but like what you've alluded to say that more than the Constitution is required, is that we lack federalism. We lack the decentralization of political culture, and that is kind of what we've been doing. We did a roadshow, the Free Market Foundation, right before the 2024 election, where we went specifically to DA municipalities, but we've spoken to municipalities across the board to say that actually you need to be flexing a lot more. You need to be doing more, even if the central government says, hey, you can't do that or you shouldn't do that. You should just do it, because there is a federal culture missing, and federal culture is nothing if being in tension and being in competition with other spheres of government. That's the defining feature. You fight amongst yourselves. That is why federalism exists, is for that tension. But even our federalists in the DA, and specifically the IFP, which has a very, very strong federalist pedigree and heritage, kind of just defer. They just assume, again, South Africa is a unitary state and they have to do whatever the central government tells them, when that is not necessarily the case. Sometimes it's the case. Even then, you'd have to kind of push back, but it's not necessarily the case, but it's assumed to be. So we have that cultural issue, and as your article kind of alludes to, Ayanda, is that there is this element of race that's now kind of arbitrarily associated with it. Federalism has never been on the side of apartheid in South Africa. Like the Federalists have always been anti-NP. Like the oldest forms of federalism in South Africa, you could say, go back into the pre-colonial days. There's a bunch of academics who say that kind of traditional communities in South Africa were effectively federalist, without putting it in those words, which I think is interesting, and then potentially a lot of value there. But if you look at the formalized South African state, you'll find that the federal idea was a lot more concentrated in English South Africans, British kind of emissaries to South Africa, and then specifically after the union was formed, the very highly centralized union was formed in 1910, federalism was at its most pronounced in the Natal province, where the English kind of descendants there wanted a federal dispensation because they feared what the National Party was going to do to kind of the English heritage of Natal. So they wanted a fully federalized system. And then in the 1970s, it was Inkatha and the Progressive Federal Party, hardline opponents of apartheid and segregation, saying that no, we need a federal system. We need to decentralize power. Liberals, I'm reading a book now by Edgar Harry Brooks from the 1960s, very strong federalist, very strongly anti-national party. But then almost arbitrarily in the late 1980s, suddenly federalism is a idea of racism. And if going into the 1990s, everyone who says we need to federalize South Africa are apologists for apartheid, and that kind of we need a centralized unitary system like the one that the National Party has been governing under for the past kind of 40 years, 50 years, and people lapped that up. I mean, the National Party itself became federalist in the last 4 years of its existence, but surely that can't be enough to now say, oh, all federalism is somehow tainted. Though the centralization, the kind of centralism of the National Party, somehow that doesn't taint unitarism. Somehow, but it's federalism taints kind of federalism. No, no. So yeah, it happened very arbitrarily, and liberals and federalists got swept up in it, and that muted the discourse unjustifiably. And I'm glad to see, and I think you point this out in your article as well, that it's back on the agenda now. More and more people are actually talking about it. Ernst Root started the Lex Libertas initiative, which is almost specifically about that. The FMF has its campaign for home rule. So yeah, I think it's not sufficiently back on the agenda, but we need to kind of do the work to put it there. And I think constitutional change has to be part of the discussion, but you don't even have to go there. We just actually have to start accepting that the constitution is formally federal and start packing kind of a political cultural federalist meat onto the bones. Yes, it's going to be tough, it's going to have costs, there's going to be conflict, real conflict doing that, but that's how it works. That's how all the great federations of the world have been forged, through conflict in part. So we just have to be kind of open to that and embrace that process. Zakes, I think you also have a lot of thoughts on federalism.
Yeah, federalism, cool, right? But yeah, man, shout out to Umaga. But yes, that was the coolest article. That was a cool article. The problem with federalism, given our current constitutional, dispensation, is that, oh, man, like the US is making me super jaded. I'm sorry, man, because like that is the most federal state in the world, one would say, right? And man, you are the realist in me is like, yeah. You think the people of Illinois can get to decide whether they have, military men deployed on their states? They don't. They will have military men deployed, and there's nothing you're gonna do about it. So yeah, I guess, but though we can take lessons from that, right? You can only think if hey, there were still militias in all of these states, then it would be much more harder for these federal military men to be deployed there, and that is something that we need to take cognizance of. But it is something that like we definitely should aspire to. To Martin's point, our constitution already is, federal. It divides certain competencies between provinces all the way down to municipalities. As Martin said, municipalities have, the power to take out loans from international finance institutions. Like they can they can put you in debt. As the city of Johannesburg currently owes a bunch of international financial institutions too. So like municipalities have a whole lot of power, and I think it is for our current end right now. I like things like the project for home rule is like that is what we should be pushing for. I think the state or the general, I want to say those who uphold this idea of a unitary state, right? There's something that I guess they like about it, but the only way to show them that our constitution is like this, is to actually do the things, right? Like do the things that are currently empowered or that are currently within your grasp. Do them like and pursue them to their fullest extent, so that then becomes a basis to argue for more. As you said, if there is the need for constitutional amendment, then that becomes the basis. Like, we already have this and would like for more of that to expand, right? All of the general benefits. I study a whole lot of George Aite, and George Aite makes a very good argument about, the former federal nature of African jurisdictions in large part, to your point, Martin. So it is pretty disheartening that, federalism is associated with a particular set of people. The idea that idea is associated with a particular set of people is absurd, seeing as everyone can just hold an idea. But yeah, it is pretty absurd. But also, if you to still man and try and understand where all of these people are coming from, right? You get like people are pretty emotional, right? I, for instance, don't see like, I'm like, if you're being racist or someone thinks you're being racist, call someone racist. I just don't want the state to be like, you racist now, to jail. Give a piece of your property to this person. Like, no, no, I'm racist. And yeah, you can go F yourself if you want to, really. And if society decides to give me consequences for that, then great, as society should. If my neighbors are like, yeah, no, we don't want to invite you to our pride anymore because of your ideas, then good. That is what should happen. That will hopefully make me reflect and change my fucking mind, right? But yeah, nah, so I get where someone would be like, hey, if some oak is being racist, then call them racist. Really, I just don't want any state, action to stem from that. But with federalism specifically, man, like it is the furthest thing, like from being that, right? It empowers people without power. Like, someone in a rural area will get to decide their fate. But the other side of it is, do South Africans, does the rural South African want to do that, right? This is something which, do they want to decide their fate? Do they want to be the ones to govern themselves, who, ideally collect their own taxes, decide their own policy, and all of these things are pretty involved. And I think it is much more easier for a segment of the South African population to be like, let those oaks in Pretoria and Cape Town take care of all of this stuff, and I guess I will just comply with it. And that is what we don't want. That is horrible. It creates a whole lot of problems, like we currently do have. Like, and currently we have a situation whereby we have a national police commissioner who was interfering with the work being done at the provincial level. Right? Federalism solves that, people. Where the general Mkhwanazi answers to no one but the people of KZN, and so does the police commissioner of Gauteng province and things like that. So the actual practical implications of this, particularly given our corrupt culture in South Africa, they can be hugely beneficial. This is why Makeba's article is pretty great, and I think really what we ought to do is rather than using Makeba's article as the argumentative basis and like things like the project for home rule, right? Rather than talk about all of this stuff, let's be about it. We just do these things in municipalities, and hopefully, and of course, that will need people to, if it, like the starting point is changing your voting patterns, because if you change who you vote for in your municipality next year, hopefully, then that will have a spiraling effect, because your municipality will be able to do things, take out loans or not take out loans. I would suggest not take out loans, but yeah. So then it can spiral from that, and then you can work through things like I'm a algorithm pretty much, like whatever you can take charge of what some of these development districts around Johannesburg are doing, and like taking care of like the services around their businesses, ensuring that the streets are clean, having security guards. I know ever there are big offices like Standard Bank, Nedbank, or anything like that, they usually have their own private security just around the premises. Here I'm close to the Lancet laboratories, and they also have that. So I'm like, the things like that, we just have to do this, and the government will find it much more harder. Well, the national government, the unitary one, will find it much more harder to be like, yo, stop doing that, because, well, it'll have to say that. It'll have to say stop doing that. Now, when we ask for permission, it can easily say no. But when you are actually within the midst of something, then they will have to say stop doing that. And I think that is much more harder to say than no. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Ayanda.
Yeah, I totally agree with Zakes on his point about the structure of African jurisdictions. I think he highlights what really are the practical benefits of federalism in an area like policing where you devolve powers. There's benefits like increased capacity, there's less interference from the top, and at a provincial level, police officers like Mkwanazi can actually do their job without being, bothered by politicians. But for me, I think I actually wanted to ask Zakes this particular question. We did discuss this the other day when we were in the office, and this has to do with the national question and the question of identity, because that's the angle I took in the piece. And what I really argued was that South Africa is a nation of nation, or a community of communities. So the question I would want to pose to Zakes here is, do you agree, Zakes, that for a country as diverse as ours, you need a political system that can accommodate that diversity, and that you shouldn't assume that there's homogeneity in terms of our values, and that there are differences between us, and that even what we call South African identity itself can be incompatible with our own values as people? I think that's the question I have for Zeke.
Hmm. No, it's interesting. I think I'm trying to remember the answer I gave last time. I want to, so that I actually am using that. But like, I think, as I said last time, theoretically, the idea of states and state identity, like, that to me is a nonsense idea, because there's no such thing like as a state identity. I think we were talking that day, and you're saying that, the civic identity and, like, ethnic identity and all of these things. And I'm like, no, the idea of civic identity in and of itself comes from a particular context. So the reason why I'm so drawn to, like, I think the strongest argument to me, firstly, agreeing with your point, right? Your first point that, for diverse, every state is diverse, right? Even the people in Japan are diverse, even though a lot of people be like, a homogeneous, and like, ideally everyone would benefit from a state that does not impose values on anyone, right? The values have to be objective, they have to be neutral. Things like equality before the law, like, or self-determination, something that is neutral, that you can then take on your own subjective impulse onto. I think that is the best way to go, because for specifically the South African state, right? The idea of the South African state is also in and of itself problematic. As we mentioned, there were jurisdictions that existed prior to the South African state. They got usurped through violence. We find ourselves through here in the South African state. So the idea that it should be used as sort of a standard, really, to me, like, nah. What we should be using as a standard, rather, is, core principles that we want a society in general. Firstly, the whole world, I guess, but our immediate surrounding society here to live by. And, like, principles like, hey, you have the right to own things, have the right to own yourself, you have the right to move freely if you aren't harming people. Like, these are things that I think we can then, depending on whatever cultural impulse, like, you can have people who, using their rights to freely associate and own things, who can then constitute themselves and be like, no, we want to live specifically like this, under the basis of self-determination, and, sign a contract if you want to come into here. I'm talking about an anarchist society here. So, I'm very biased in that regard, because I hate being confined to the state. But to your point, federalism is the answer, man. Like, until we get to anarchy, we definitely do need the ability for people to govern themselves, right? I think South Africa too would benefit a whole lot from that, because, it is unfortunate that we currently have a unitary state, and within that, even linguistic groups, right? Linguistic groups are used as a form of, I guess, nationhood, in South Africa, which is unfortunate because the linguistic groups in and of themselves are varied. There are various, at least historically, nations within linguistic groups, right? Within the Zulu linguistic groups, as we always talk, there are various nations within there. That's where not necessarily part of the Zulu kingdom, but are now called part of the Zulu nation. If a party like the IFP, for instance, were to argue for secession, everyone lives in KZN would be considered part of that nation when historically they weren't. But of course, culture is dynamic, it always changes, so people can always reinvent themselves and identify however they deem fit. But I think that, given all of these, nuances, these differences, and I want to stick to differences within the black population because this is something that we do tend to forget, right? That we do have them, even though there are a whole lot of commonalities, right, within the you would say in our linguist, just sticking with language, there are a lot of commonalities within our languages as Bantu speaking people, but there are still a whole lot of differences too. And I think that's why federalism has to be the only answer, particularly not only in South Africa, but in Africa in general, right? I weep every day for the potential of what could have been the Biafra state. The Biafra, we could have probably had our first instance of a developed economy if that state was allowed to exist, because I'm a huge admirer of Igbo, culture and their general way of doing this life thing. So I think, we cannot then fully realize all of this wonderful diversity that we have in seeing the world, right? LPP, like in how the world should look like, and how people should live their lives, and how humans should pursue happiness. I think we need as many variations as possible of that. And to get that, we definitely need people to be able to govern themselves. So yeah.
Mm.
And then concerning the civic identity, I'm like, yeah, nah, nah. The national identity, I'm like, people can reinvent themselves. And I think federalism is a great way for people to do that, right? As you see in the United States, people from Texas would probably identify more with being Texan than being American in general. Like they don't share anything with people who live in California in terms of cultural identity, right? So I think federalism helps too in reinforcing and building these cultural communities within a general overarching context. But yeah, I'm talking too much.
Yeah, so I can recommend to everyone who's interested in the question that Ayanda asked to read this book by Professor Kwes Malan, um, Politicracy, an assessment of the coercive logic of the territorial state and ideas around a response to it. It's freely downloadable from the Pretoria University Law Press. So please just Google it and you can download the book and read it. This is a deep kind of investigation by Professor Malan into what national identity means and how specifically from the French Revolution onwards, there was a concerted process to create national identities for the state rather than these things being organic and spontaneous cultural phenomena that kind of emerge, like Hayek would say, kind of spontaneously from human interaction. There was a concerted effort to craft people who identify primarily by the state, and that is kind of national statism, state nationalism, effectively kind of the popular form of nationalism that we know today. And that's also this idea that underlies the fallacy that there is such a thing as a South African nation. There is no such thing as a South African nation. And if anyone has had their articles edited by me, you would have seen that I've always removed the nation and replaced it with the country or the state and so on, because that is what South Africa is. It's a state, it's a country, it is not a nation. There are multiple nations in South Africa, and the kind of, as Zakes alluded to, what we consider to be a nation is potentially also just itself a collection of nations. The Zulu nation might be a collection of various nations as well, because what is a nation? A nation is it's a shared understanding of politics. It's a shared understanding of history. It's a shared culture. It's often a shared religion. It's often a shared language. So these are kind of real organic things that you can see that exist. Whereas the supposed South African nation, I've never seen it. Someone would have to show me what that is and what the kind of identifying marks of it are. Being a citizen of South Africa does not make you a member of a nation. So yeah, I would, if you're interested in questions of national identity and so on, this is a very important book, and I would encourage people to resist the idea of a South Africanism, because it's artificial and it's violent. It's very violent when you go down that path of so-called nation building. When you tell people, hey, you're not allowed to speak your language anymore, only in private. You're only allowed to kind of speak your language in your house, but out here in South Africa, we all speak English. That is violence. I mean, you should not do that because it becomes policy, it becomes law. Really, there should be a deference to what people want to do and how they want to express themselves without the state dictating these things, because then you'll really see a flowering of various beautiful kind of differences between people, and once people can do that freely, on that basis they cooperate across national lines kind of on a voluntary basis, and that's what real community is ultimately premised on and based on. And yes, that's what federalism solves, because we do have this one single polity that's called South Africa, this one single state. I have my doubts about it ever being kind of balkanized. Maybe it will, but the chances of that are quite slim. And but that doesn't mean the problem goes away. There's a problem here. We have multiple diverging cultural and national communities that are forced to obey the same policies about their healthcare, their education, their kind of social services, and it just doesn't compute. We are not a homogenous nation like Japan, which, I mean, I think they could also benefit by some federalism, but the Japanese are remarkably kind of one-minded about many things. And then it kind of makes sense to have a unitary state in those circumstances. But not here, not in the US, not in not in many places, not in the UK, not in Spain, etc., where federalism is necessary. So yeah, I mean, I really do encourage people to be careful about what how they talk about these things, because how we conducted discourse about these things determines ultimately the policies. It determines what we do about these things, is how we talk about these things. So stop talking about the national government. There's no such thing as a national government in South Africa. There's a central government in South Africa. Yeah, just I can't emphasize that book enough. So yeah, we're just one more point about something we said earlier. I know Mkwanazi is now a national hero, but in one of these committees, he attacked Panyaza Lesufi, who I attacked earlier, but now I'm going to defend Panyaza Lesufi. He attacked Panyaza because Panyaza established a police force in Gauteng, and Mkwanazi said that's illegal. He should be stopped. So no, in that case, I'm very much against Mkwanazi and very much for Premier Lesufi. I'm sure his police force is absolutely trash and that it can't kind of organize a piss up in a brewery. But the fact is, he is doing federalism. He doesn't call it that, but he is doing federalism. And what he did there is exactly what kind of DA governments, IFP governments around the country need to be doing, is to say, I'm going to do this thing. We want a police force. We're establishing a police force. That is the right mentality in a federal dispensation. And on that score, Mkwanazi is very wrong, and Panyaza Lesufi is very right. Even if you don't have to like the man, you don't have to like how Amapanyaza is constituted, how they're trained. It doesn't matter. The principle is the important thing here, and we shouldn't stop governments from taking these kinds of steps, except to the degree that they violate people's liberty and their property. Then, of course, tangible steps must be taken against them. Okay, guys, our time is almost up, but I'm going to give Ayanda and then Zake's last word, and then I will wrap it up for us. Ayanda.
Really, my last word has to do with the two topics we've been discussing. We certainly can do better in South Africa. We can opt for reform. On the first count, we can certainly have a much smaller cabinet than we have. As the Free Market Foundation, we have the solutions, we have made the propositions. I think really at the heart of the problem is a lack of political will, and something which Zakes also touched on earlier on, which is just how politics unfolds in real life. It doesn't always unfold how we want it to unfold. And on the other hand, certainly we can benefit from decentralization in South Africa. We can benefit, from example, from power being devolved to these lower spheres of governments, where we can have these police forces that Banyaza and them are establishing, and they really can also increase capacity, because this is what one of the benefits of having these divisions, that they can increase capacity in the country. As it stands, we have a shortage of detectives, for example, in our country. So these local governments should have the power to investigate crimes, to have their own ballistics units, and so forth. These are all things that can enhance the quality of governance in this country and give more people freedom. Reducing the cabinet saves billions of rands. This is money which can be redirected to productive activity, to investment. These are all things that can benefit people. So really, my point is freedom is going to benefit everyone. It will have positive benefits for everyone. And we need to get to a point where we realize that. That means we need to do the work, of course, of convincing people, of convincing parties, as Zeke said, to move to the right side. And I'd like to think we're doing that, and we should keep doing it until we succeed. Zakes always says he will only ever rest once we have a capitalist president. I don't know when that will happen in South Africa. I'm not sure. I don't foresee it happening in my lifetime, though. I'm not being pessimistic. But yeah, we will fight until that point. Really, yeah, we should fight until that point.
Well said, Zakes.
Yeah. I mean, really, I feel like I've been talking for a whole lot, right? So, liberty, great. Capitalist president needed. But yeah, man, I think the size of cabinet issue for me is an important one, primarily because it's something that I've also been writing about for a very long time, and like it is so connected to a whole lot of our problems. Getting rid of portfolios gets rid of the red tape associated with those portfolios, and it will do amazing things for our economy on that side. And I want to pay less taxes. I want to always preach that when you speak of cutting things in the state, it must be tied to cutting taxes, because that is what will make it much more easier to sell to people when you're going to tell them that, hey, you will have more money at the end of the month. I'm like, who doesn't love that, right? We all love that. So yeah, man, cut the size of the state. And the federalism issue, federalism is needed. I think I've spoken a whole lot about it. I love the federalism. My favorite book is Right South Africa, The Solution, which still is pretty much the best template for what the South African state ought to look like, right down to this day. So yeah, man, because we are diverse, that is why we need federalism. It is because of this wonderful diversity that we have. It will allow us to fully flower in the beautiful. Then we will fully embody what is this motto that is in our coat of arms, right? Strength and diversity, something like that. I think there truly is something beautiful about that. So yeah, federalism, great. Liberty, good. As I said, definitely need a capitalist president. I'm a realistic optimist. I'm a realist who's also an optimist. So I will forever remain an optimist. I doubt, the fighting may look different in the future, definitely, but it cannot stop. It cannot stop. So yeah, liberty, cool.
And that's a great way to end it on. And that's how we should always end these shows. But thank you, gentlemen. That was a very kind of deep discussion, I think. We started with cutting the cabinet, kind of very practical stuff, and we ended up considering some very deep matters of national identity, which I think are important. These conversations should be had. We shouldn't allow the political elite to dictate to us kind of what the status quo should be. To say that no, we're a unitary state. We are. They use this word united, but they use it very euphemistically. We are united, and we will not consider any discussions on decentralization, on austerity, of cutting the size of the state. We will just do what was predetermined in 1969, the Mokoro Conference of the ANC, centralize, redistribute, kind of, and regulate. No, that we shouldn't accept that, and that starts with actually just starting to talk about these things, and talk about them in a serious sense. It's not an academic matter. We need to have people in business, in civil society, talking about these things as if they are just on the horizon, because then we can make that happen. We do have to set an ideal for what we want South Africa to be, and how we want to live here. And I think most sensible people will agree that we want a lean state. That if any state at all, we want it to be lean, and we want it to do what kind of the basic things very well, without corruption. But we also want there to be subsidiarity, where people have a greater influence on the things that specifically affect them and their families and their communities, rather than have just being swept up like pawns in the grand political games of faraway people. I don't think if you put that to anyone, that they would want that, people to kind of be pawns in someone else's political game. So yeah, we want people to thrive, in a decentralized, limited government state. And yeah, it's difficult ultimately, like Zake said, to kind of totally reject that truth, because it is true. There's a fundamental element of truth there. But that is it for us this week. We will be back again, same time, same place next week. Um, I want to encourage everyone, if you enjoyed this content, to please like the video, please share it, please subscribe to the Rational Standard YouTube channel. Visit us at rationalstandard.com or rationalstandard.co.za. Either one works, to see our written content, like Ayanda's article there. A lot of content goes up there every week. Please restack that on Substack, or like it as well and share it elsewhere. We would really appreciate that. And yeah, just thank you for joining us, and we will see you again next week. Cheerio, and enjoy the rest of your weekends.